It would seem that in our current age, that more and more people are waking up than ever before in the history of mankind. It's hard to know whether there is indeed an increase in awakening, or if it's just become more noticeable, perhaps more acceptable to even to talk about it. But perhaps the very fact that it's become so acceptable is itself a sign that it's actually occurring with greater frequency. But I think there's a bit of confusion between what it means to be in a process of awakening and to be fully and completely awake. And I should interject here that I'm not fully awake. So this is a topic which I'm not fully qualified to speak on. But what I can say is that I'm in a process of awakening, and I've been in this process for much of my life. And I've also observed others around me who seem to be going through a very similar process. But what I sometimes observe are those who claim to be fully awakened when clearly they're not. And that's really what brings me to speak on this topic. I think that many of us have an overly romanticized idea about spiritual awakening. We often imagine it to be something sudden and spontaneous, and perhaps it does occur that way for some. I really can't say because it hasn't been that way for me, but what I've observed in myself as well as in many others is that it's often a very long, gradual process. And that process may begin with something sudden and spontaneous. We might have a sudden epiphany or insight. We might undergo a sudden shift in perception. Perhaps we have a traumatic experience which causes us to question the very purpose and meaning of life. Perhaps we've experimented with psychedelics which revealed to us that we're not merely confined to this physical form. Or perhaps we simply read a book or saw a video on the internet, and all of a sudden it clicked that all of these social constructs, the political and economic systems, the religious institutions, that it's all an illusion, a sort of collective insanity. And those kinds of moments can be extremely potent. We might suddenly realize that we've been asleep this whole time. And in that sudden realization, we might mistakenly think that we have woken up completely. I hear people all the time say that they're awake, but I want to emphasize that there's a distinct difference between the state of waking and the state of being fully awake. And I would say that for most of us, that initial moment, that sudden shift in our perception is more of an initiation into the awakening process. It's like being shaken out of your sleep, but even after we've opened our eyes, we may still be in a bit of a haze. If we confuse that awakening process as being fully awake, then we can actually hinder the process because we stop right there. We don't go any further. So imagine, for example, you realize one day that your house is a mess and that many of the things you've been collecting over the years are completely unnecessary. So you have this sudden epiphany that you don't need all of these things. But then what? If you stop right there and just sit back down in your chair, the house remains a mess. It's not enough to simply acknowledge the mess. Now you've got to begin cleaning. So with awakening, we might have a sudden realization, but after that realization comes the practice. And that can take a long time for some of us, depending on how much attention we're willing to give to it. So my awakening began in my late childhood. I don't recall exactly how old I was, but it's probably about 10 years old when my perception underwent a significant change. And in the time since, I've experienced a number of sporadic shifts in awareness, moments of disillusionment and moments of clarity. But then there's a tendency to fall back into old familiar patterns of thought and behavior and even social conditioning. So it's something that, at least for me, tends to come in waves, and waves rise and fall. But each time I become more and more aware, and the more awareness there is, the more I realize that there is still so much to process, so much to learn, so much more clutter that needs to be cleared. I think it's important to recognize that awakening is a gradual process for most of us, and to embrace that process with patience. Because we can be so eager to be fully awake that we either become overwhelmed by how much work there seems to be needed, or we fool ourselves into believing that the work is finished when actually we're just avoiding the work. We're denying or repressing the ego, the shadow self, the subconscious mechanisms. And when we're denying that part of ourselves rather than bringing awareness to it, we're actually lulling ourselves back into a dream state. The real work of awakening is to acknowledge everything that's going on inside of us. We don't transcend the ego simply by burying it, by pretending it isn't there, but by delving into it and coming to fully understand its nature. And the reason why this can be such a long and difficult process is because there's so much resistance there. We don't want to look at it. We would rather it just go away, and we can easily convince ourselves that the ego has dissolved, but that's just what the ego wants you to believe. So it's a bit of a trickster in that way. So again, I think it's important not to romanticize awakening as something always spontaneous and spectacular. And we can look to some of the most well-known self-realized persons as examples of how it may be a gradual process for many of us. Perhaps one of the best examples is the historical Buddha. I'm talking about Siddhartha Gautama, who lived some 2,500 years ago. But there have been many Buddhas throughout time. Buddha simply means one who is awake. Siddhartha Gautama is simply one of the more well-recognized Buddhas in history. And we tend to think that his awakening was a very sudden occurrence, but actually, if we look at his life, we see that it was even a very gradual process, even for him. Before he was a Buddha, Siddhartha was a prince who had been living a very sheltered life. His father had arranged that he should not see or experience anything disturbing, and he went to great lengths to ensure this. But as Siddhartha grew older, he became anxious and restless, wanting to leave the palace and see the city that he was to later rule over. His father arranged a parade that would take him through the most beautiful parts of the city, and he set guards along the streets to keep out anyone who wasn't young and beautiful and healthy. But there was an old man who had crept up to catch a glimpse of the prince as he went by on his chariot, and the prince caught sight of him as well. Siddhartha turned to his companion and he asked why the man looked so strange. His companion explained to him that the man was old, that everyone grows old. But this was all very new to Siddhartha, and it awoke a curiosity within him. It was also at that moment that the guards noticed the old man and escorted him away from the crowd, and Siddhartha followed after them and found himself wandering in an impoverished part of the city where there were many people who were old as well as diseased. And seeing those who were diseased, he again inquired why they appeared so strange, and his companion explained to him that these people are sick, and that everyone becomes sick at some point in life. And as Siddhartha continued his exploration of the city. He came upon the cremation grounds where a body was being burned. And it was there that his companion explained to him that everyone dies, that death is an inevitable part of life. So, seeing all of this was a profound realization for Siddhartha. He experienced a sudden shift in his perspective. The world was not as he had believed it to be. Life was not as he had believed it to be. And now he saw that there was so much suffering in life. And in witnessing the suffering of others, he felt a great sense of suffering in himself. This was the beginning of his awakening process. And it was then that he had vowed to find an end to all suffering. So, against his father's wishes, he left the palace and renounced his royalty. And he went to live in the forest with the ascetics who practiced extreme austerities. They were pursuing an end to suffering by denying the body of all pleasure. So they seldom ate. They would meditate in both extreme heat and cold, naked and exposed to the elements. They would engage in practices which pushed the body and the mind to undergo great discomfort in order to transcend it. And Siddhartha lived among them for many, many years and had so surpassed them in their austerity that they actually began looking upon him as their mentor. But despite all of this, he was greatly unsatisfied. He still had not transcended suffering. And then one day when he was sitting by the river, Siddhartha overheard a conversation between a musician and his student. And the musician was explaining how to tune the instrument. If the string is too tight, it will snap. If it's too loose, it will slap. So in that moment, Siddhartha had another profound realization. He had lived in both extreme luxury as well as in extreme austerity, and neither of these had brought him any lasting satisfaction. So perhaps the way to enlightenment was somewhere in the middle, a balance between the two, neither indulging too much nor denying. And he realized that desire and aversion are really two sides of the same coin. But that epiphany did not mean that he was fully liberated. Following this new insight, he left the ascetics and went on alone. And he found a tree where he sat down and vowed not to move from that place until he had become fully liberated. And as he sat in meditation, all of his subconscious mechanisms arose to the surface. There he was faced with his shadow self, his lust and greed, fear and anger, ego identification, self-doubt, and all of the many issues that confound all of us. And one by one he observed them, examined them, and saw through them. It was in this way that he transcended them. And it was only after this that he would come to be known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One. Often we romanticize that moment in his life, forgetting that for Siddhartha the process of awakening had begun many years prior to this. And I think that this can actually be very encouraging, because if it was a gradual process for him, then we shouldn't feel so discouraged or frustrated by the fact that it may be a long, gradual process for us as well. So we can take solace in this, and we can embrace the process with patience. We don't have to force anything, and there's really no hurry. In fact, trying to get somewhere is what prevents us from being present. And if we try to fake it till we make it, we just get stuck in the pretense, never actually making any real progress. The process of awakening is really about bringing awareness into every aspect of our thinking and perceiving, And this means owning all of the bullshit, not denying it. With loving acceptance, we can recognize our blockages, our false beliefs, our emotional reactions, without self-judgment or harsh criticism. And we can learn to be more authentic. That simply means not trying to be enlightened, but simply acknowledging where we are right here, right now, unenlightened, with all of our flaws and imperfections, and not being ashamed of it. It means allowing those undesirable qualities to be known, to be noticed and acknowledged, to be compassionately accepted, but also to examine them, to understand them, and it's by understanding them in depth that they gradually dissolve on their own, without any need to struggle or strive. So we don't need to try and force awakening to happen. We can be very relaxed about it, allowing it to unfold naturally and effortlessly. All we need to do is observe the process with greater awareness, without resistance to what is. And perhaps the greatest key to becoming more awakened is simply recognizing how asleep we really are.